In 2021, the book Settlers, The Myth of the White Proletariat, written by Honolulu-based Japanese-American Jay Sakai, who I suspect is a Trotskyist calling himself a Maoist because he's definitely not Marxist-Leninist, has formed the baseline of the mainline thought within the contemporary Western left, firmly entrenching itself within the halls of liberal bourgeois academia, progressive, presenting as leftist nonprofit organizations and activist communities as a means to dismantle colonial settlerism, absent of dismantling neoliberalism. Never mind telling the petty bourgeois sociology and anthropology professors providing instruction at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the University of California, and other prestigious institutions of the same ilk, advancing Sakai's theory, are inherently built on the structure of so-called colonial settlerism, as upheld by the neoliberal economic system that we currently live under. Hey, gotta pay off those student loan debts, right? In short, if you have never read Settlers, the theory of the book supposes that late 19th century and early 20th century Southern and Eastern European immigrants fleeing potato famines, revolutions, pogroms, religious persecution, and feudalism are in the same exact mindset of the 15th century Western European Christian Crusader imperialists who were attempting to circumvent the Mongol-controlled Silk Road, or I should say, the Mongol-controlled but often contested by the Ottomans and other Islamic caliphates controlled Silk Road to find western passage to China and India via the Atlantic Ocean, but then got preoccupied by the Columbian accident of happening upon a cartographical anomaly which would be renamed as the Americas. Subsequently, followed by typical Crusader state standard operational procedure in the Americas, which had no previous exposure to old world shenanigans, conquest, slave trade, ravaging and pillaging in the name of God and the monarch, also practiced by the Islamic Ottoman Empire and the Mongolian Empire alike at the same exact time. Do not tell that to Jay Sakai, who thinks history started in 1492 and who thinks that a Russian Jewish immigrant getting off the boat in New York in 1885, fleeing the genocidal wrath of Tsar Alexander III, crammed with 12 other bodies in an unventilated and musty old law dumbbell tenement building on the Lower East Side, working 18 hours a day for $2 a day every day sewing clothing, is just as evil as the 15th century Christian Crusaders implementing Old World standard operational procedure on the New World, and much later the reprehensible Andrew Jackson for massacring the indigenous and enslaving people from Africa. This would also be akin to some activists in Hawaii calling lower-income Micronesians, Filipinos, Samoans, and Chinese immigrants working 2 jobs at Zippy's for 8 hours and then at the Aloha store for another 8 hours as colonial settlers, as if they were personally the emissaries of Sanford Dole, Lauren Thurston, and the Big Five, and they themselves were responsible for overthrowing the Hawaiian monarchy in the name of establishing a capitalist bourgeois dictatorship branded as a republic with United States protection. First world, third worldists say we need to have a difficult discussion about privilege and colonialism. Yes, let's have this difficult discussion right now relative to the overall history of settlerism. Breaking it down to the most common denominator, the origin point of the original Homo sapiens derives from Africa. At one point, everywhere that was anywhere outside of Africa was somewhere that was uninhabited and therefore unsettled, which means that the Homo sapiens who left Africa to settle somewhere else and who had children who left the place their parents settled to settle somewhere else, and so on and so forth. And guess what? We are their descendants, which therefore makes all of us the descendants of settlers, as it is human nature to migrate from place to place in the event of fluctuations relative to material conditions, climate, food supply, regional stability, as such as relative to the evolutionary process. Anthropology 101, folks, and I am by no means an expert in the anthropology field, and neither is Jay Sakai, apparently. there's another term which is not being used by pretentious petty bourgeois academic liberals who throw around the term colonial settler as a means to sound enlightened, as opposed to the dumb settler schleps who work 9 to 5 and have no such time for cultural edification. That term is imperialism. Imperialism is when culture A asserts its unwanted hegemony over culture B in the name of expanding its sphere of influence, often as a means to extract and monopolize natural resources for the benefit of culture A by the means of subjugating, co-opting, and or exploiting culture B. Justification for imperialism is usually tied to the spread of a religion. For the past 1,500 years, it's normally been either Christianity or Islam. Opening markets by force for capital accumulation, usually done through exporting democracy or monarchism. And in the extreme case of Jacksonian democracy, the Ottoman Turks and the Nazis, ethnic supremacy for the sake of ethnic supremacy, religion and markets notwithstanding. And while undoubtedly imperialism within the Americas has been the domain of states born from Western European Christian monarchies and still exists as a problem in our time, to Sakai's dismay, Western Europe did not invent the concept of imperialism or colonialism, for that matter. Before there was Rome, there was Egypt. And before there was Egypt, there was the Macedonian Empire. And before there was the Macedonian Empire, there was Persia, modern-day Iran. And before there was Persia, there was Babylon, modern-day Iraq. And why do you think we say Babylon all the time? All of those empires invaded, colonized, enslaved, murdered, and plundered areas beyond the point of their origins. Where do you think Western European Christian monarchs, and by extension, a certain Polynesian monarch who appropriated Western military tactics, gunpowder, munitions, and culture as a means to monopolize resources and subjugate people who did not want to pay tithes to them, only to create an imperial apparatus which would voluntarily adopt Western Christianity as a means to justify its own existence, while Western Christians were plotting their own subversive imperialist coup on said Polynesian Christian monarchy? Think about that. You want to decolonize, but bring back the monarch, which was based in colonialism. Yeah, no, doesn't work. In addition to capitalist industrialists, where do you think they learned all this imperialist shit from? 3,000 years worth of bloodshed and power in the name of empire building, traced all the way back to Babylon. And what the RED settlers crowd does not understand is that imperialism is what creates imperialism. Let's start in the year 610 Common Era. Islam originated out of Arabia, which at the time Arabia, whose inhabitants were polytheistic and divided among themselves, with the Judaism dominant within the Himyarite Yemen to the south and Christian Byzantium pushing into the Persian Gulf, looking to spread their influence. Muhammad devised a religion, Islam, incorporating both Christianity and Judaism and uniting the warring Arabic tribes divided by polytheism to stop the Himyarites and the Byzantines from colonizing Arabia. But then when Muhammad died in 632, Abu Bakr took over and establishing the Rashidun Caliphate, which would export Islam to the west to Tunisia and east to Iran and north to present-day Georgia over the next 30 years. When the Umayyad Caliphate replaced the Rashidun Caliphate, over the next 100 years, they would spread Islam all the way to Spain and all the way to India. And then when the Baghdad-based Abbasid Caliphate took over from the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasids spread Islam into Italy in 849. But then they were ousted by the Italians in 871. 200 years later, in 1092, Byzantium got nervous, because the Abbasids are kind of closing in on them, and called for Pope Urban to help. So the Pope called for the Western European kingdoms to save the Holy Land, but really spread Christianity to China. And the Western Christian counter-conquests and counter-colonialism called the Crusades against Islam would commence and go on for 200 years, with Rome looting and ransacking Constantinople, because why not? And then from the east, the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan, who had a dispute with China and took over China, decided to go west and partake in some crusader fun. killing, colonizing, that sort of stuff. Yeah, they killed some 40 million people along the way, creating their empire and scaring the West to go back, west. But then after Genghis Khan died, the Mongol Empire would eventually break up over the years into separate empires called the Golden Horde. And the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was coming on its own to the north of Arabia, would eventually come into existence and sack Constantinople and rename it Istanbul, and then the Turks would spread their brand of Islam south into Arabia. And then the Turco-Mongol Islamic warlord, Tamerlane, would then come into existence, and he would try to rebuild the Mongolian Empire, killing an additional 20 million people along the way, but then die on his way to China in 1405. Meanwhile, back in the West, Christians, when they, weren't killing each other and, trying to win back Spain from the Muslims, were like, hey, maybe we should find a sea route to China, LOL. And after 90 years, they decided to sail west on the Atlantic Ocean and accidentally come upon the Americas. And guess what? They decided to do there the same damn thing, because that's all they ever knew. So by this process of imperialism, colonialism, counter-imperialism, counter-colonialism, counter-imperialism, then counter-colonialism, do we blame the Mongolian Empire and Tamerlane for killing 100 million people and thus scaring the Christian West into accidentally landing into the Americas, where the Christian West would then apply Crusader state mentality onto the indigenous Americans who had no such experience with such madness taking place in the old world for, and for enabling colonialism and slavery? Or do we blame European and non-European immigrants working at Walmart and McDonald's for doing such a thing? Jay Sakai and his simple worldview appears to blame the latter and not the former. Now, as for the racist aspect of imperialism, yes, all imperialist states operate on the existence of caste systems, and caste systems are almost always based on race. The people at the top have it that banking institutions, real estate institutions, and finance institutions rig the market against BIPOCs through housing, employment, and lending discrimination to retain a caste system as a ways and means to secure their monopoly. As a result of this artificial arrangement, racist policing and race riots over employment and housing scarcity become commonplace. But as we are in, now the age of economic neoliberalism, which is the advanced stage of imperialism, those caste systems are dissolved, and the former middle class becomes a resource to be milked and exploited, economically marginalized through deindustrialization, low wages, price increases, and overpriced escapist tourism, ensuring that the rich get richer, the former European middle class becomes irrelevant, and BIPOCs are economically starved and displaced out of existence. But Jay Sakai would have you believe that settlers aren't exploited themselves, whether they choose to believe it or not, even when they are exploited, but aren't as exploited as the more historically exploited. So it is okay for the more historically exploited to fight the less historically exploited as a means to preserve the upper levels of capital who are promoting Jay Sakai's theories as a way to retain their ownership on the means and modes of production, but in the name of decolonization. In closing, the only proven method that exists to resist imperialism, which colonialism is the first stage of, is to adopt the Marxist-Leninist method of socialism, uniting all exploited masses to defy bourgeois imperialist dictatorship. Jay Sakai is not a Marxist-Leninist. He's a petty bourgeois pseudo-revolutionary calling himself a Maoist who hates the working poor and who has poisoned the minds of well-meaning leftists into believing this third-world Trotskyist philosophy into attacking the historically less exploited, so-called settlers as a mean to dismantle the upper levels of capital, except the exact opposite is happening because, look, everyone's living conditions continue to deteriorate. Look at it. Look all around you. Reject sectarianism and embrace the Internationale, for it is the Internationale that unites the human race, and it will take the human race to defeat this 3,000-year scourge of imperialism once and for all. Like and share if you feel obligated to. This is Comrade Pella, signing off.